maybe one of the first events for the LACEA this year, which is in Bogota virtually. And so I'd like to welcome everyone to the event. If there was an event or a session earlier, I apologize. You may have already taken that honor, but I'd like to welcome everyone to this live Q&A with Oriana Bandiera to discuss her three-part lecture series entitled Organizing Development. And I'd like to thank the organizers, the University of Rosario, the Econometric Society, and together with Juan Vargas for his tremendous effort in putting on this conference and hosting, and for Oriana for joining us today and putting together this lecture series. And again, for Ana Garcia Hernandez, who's behind the scenes helping us to gather questions and filter them and bring them to the session. So my name is Kyle Holloway, and I'm the Country Director for Innovations for Poverty Action. For those of you who don't know IPA, IPA is an international nonprofit dedicated to supporting policymakers and decision makers to generate and use evidence to improve program and policy design and delivery. We partner with various partners and academics like Oriana and many others that are attending this conference to design and implement research projects aimed at generating evidence and working with decision makers and policymakers to be able to use that evidence to improve the lives of people that they're serving. So I'm really excited and happy to be here today. I haven't had the opportunity to work with Oriana directly, but through IPA, during my time many years back in Uganda, I remember first hearing about Oriana's work in conversations with Munchi at BRAC about the different projects that they're working on together, both in Uganda and in other places. So it's been fun as I watched the lectures and kind of read through some of the papers to see the fruits of the labor, both things that IPA was able to support, but many things that Oriana has done with a lot of organizations throughout the years and in a variety of different countries. So it'll be fun to dive into those in greater detail. So quickly to introduce our main guest today, Oriana. Oriana Bandiera is the Sir Anthony Atkinson Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, and is a fellow of the British Academy, the Econometric Society, CEPR, BRED, IZA. She's the co-editor of Econometrica and the vice president of the European Economic Association and the director of the Gender Growth and Labor Markets in Low-Income Countries program. She also serves on the Council of the Econometric Society, on the board of the International Growth Center, and as vice president of the Colegio Carlo Alberto. Her research focuses on how monetary incentives and social relationships interact to shape individual choices within organizations, and how this shapes labor markets, the allocation of talent, and ultimately living standards. So welcome, Oriana. Thank you so much for putting together these lectures and joining us today for this discussion. Just quickly on agenda. So I think Oriana will start with an overview. Hopefully many of you had the opportunity to watch the videos that she put together, but if not, don't worry. I think she's going to give us an overview of the topics there, and then we'll go into a Q&A. We'll roughly try to order the Q&A in the order of the three lectures, focusing on questions aimed at the first lecture first, and then ending with questions aimed at the third topic or lecture last. In terms of questions, we are able to gather some questions ahead of time through the form, but many of you hopefully will feel comfortable raising your question during the session. And you can do so in the chat in Zoom publicly. And please just spell out your question clearly, and if you feel comfortable, include your name and the institution that you represent. And also, if you can tag your question as it relates maybe to a session, 1, 2, 3, or general, that will help us be able to group and prioritize the questions. And I will do my best to read your question and represent it appropriately. But if I do either one, not fully understand it or not represent it appropriately, I may call on you to ask the question directly, or feel free to jump in and kind of clarify to make sure that that it's represented well. So those are a little bit the kind of ground rules for the session. So I think we can jump into it. So Oriana, I'll hand it over to you to provide us with an overview.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to the organizers. This is not Bogota, unfortunately, but I have a rain check. They promised me that would get me there as soon as it's feasible. So, well, let me get started. This is just a summary of the lectures, and it's mostly the framework that I put together without the bits that take a lot of time, so without the papers. So I started by saying something that is always bound to offend my Northern Italian colleagues, but the point is not offensive, it's actually one of development. So when I'm actually from this bit here, and that's where I am now, this is Sicily, and I'm like from the most southern province in the most southern island of Europe. This is the most southern tip of Europe. And when I was 17, I moved here to Milan to study, to Bocconi, to study economics. And I think the first economics thought that came to my mind was how puzzling it was that, for lack of a better term, people in Milan were not quite as smart as those that I saw in Sicily. But I'm not talking about people at the university, of course. I'm talking about the people that you meet in the street, like a cab driver or a fishmonger. Now, to give you a sense of the difference in GDP between Milan and Sicily and why that was shocking to me, it was a factor of 4.5, which is the current GDP ratio between Sweden and Colombia. So imagine going from Colombia to Sweden and realizing that the people you meet, they're not quite as smart as people you see at home. And I thought it was a puzzle, but then I thought that that was actually the answer. I figured out many years later how that was the answer. And the answers got to do, that's what these lectures try to understand, why poorer countries are poorer despite having an allocation, despite having an endowment of talent, which is similar. And the idea is how the allocation of people with different talent to jobs and the availability of good jobs and the organization of labor and productivity ultimately depends on the allocation of talent. So it is not called organizing development because I'm trying to put some order, as I said in the lectures, but rather because it's a development through the lenses of organizational economics. For the longest time, I've been on this parallel track of studying development and organizations, and I always saw it as part of the same problem. And so I took advantage of these lectures to try and explain why I think that organizations are fundamental for economic development. So what I did during the lecture is to document the difference in the organization of labor along the development path, and to show how this goes from micro enterprises to large multi-sector organizations. And then I provided evidence on the market frictions that put obstacles along this path, leading to multiple equilibria, poverty traps, and misallocation. Let me just jump directly into the description of the data. Now, there's a new database that I put together with Ahmed El Sayed at IZA and Andreas Moore at UCL. This is soon to be public. It's a database that harmonizes all the censuses and the DHS surveys that we have available for all low-income and middle-income countries. The data set covers 90% of the population of these countries. And I think the cool thing about it is that we found a way of building a comparable measure of wealth. And so we can, so for the countries for which we have both surveys, we can compare that the measure of wealth matches people correctly. And for those for which we only have one survey, we can use wealth to merge them together. So this allows you to have macro statistics from micro data. The original plan for me to put this together was because every time I write a paper on one particular setting, I never know how general what I'm seeing in that setting is. And so I thought it would be much use to the community of researchers as a whole to have access to microdata on jobs, so that when you run your experiment, you can confront your reality with that of other countries. But then I realized that having this macro data actually allows us to document big changes in the organization of labor across countries. So let me start with something that we all know, and I show it as a reality check. We know that there is structural change. So in these graphs, we have GDP per capita in logs on the horizontal axis, and the share of people in agriculture in this first graph. And on the second graph on the right, the share of people in manufacturing and services. Right? And so this is the standard process of structural change. As countries become richer, there's fewer and fewer people involved in agriculture and more people involved in manufacturing and services. But now less known is that together with this process of structural change, there's also processes of organizational change. That is, here now we have the share of self-employment. You see that the share of people who are self-employed falls rapidly with development, and the share of people who get salary jobs increases equally rapidly. Now, this process begins at the top of the wealth distribution. That is, if you split people in quintiles of wealth, where the blue are the poorest and the red are the richest, and then different shades here represent the middle quintiles, you see that it is the poorest that have most self-employment in poorer countries. The richest have more wage labor. And so it's almost like a fractal structure where as the country gets richer, there are more wage jobs, but within the country, as people get richer, the richer people have more wage jobs. It's important to notice, and that's what these slides show, that this is not multicollinear with the process of structural change. The change from self-employment to wage labor occurs in every sector. Okay? It occurs in agriculture, manufacturing, and in services. And this is these lines, the dotted lines here. Okay? So the solid lines are the wage workers and the self-employed, and the dotted lines are the ratio between the two. Now, this data set covers low and middle income countries. We want to know how the story ends, right? So we can look at the full picture by adding the rich countries to this data set. Now I've extended the horizontal axis. You see before it stopped at 10, now it's up to 12. And you see that by the time you get to the richest countries in the world, the share of employee is basically 1. Now, these are the Grylikas lectures. And I mean, if you've read one paper by Zvi Grylikas, it's probably the one on the adoption of hybrid corn. And this is the famous S curve that he noticed in the adoption process. It looks like there is an S curve on the adoption of modern organizational structures, because it starts out quite flat, then there is a type of a bit where it's really steep, and then it flattens out again once everybody is in wage labor. Now, why does this matter? Well, many policies focus on removing constraints to increase productivity on the intensive margin. Things like business training, microfinance, labor drops for firms, but also within organizations, policies that use monitoring or autonomy or incentives. But these are all basically taking as given the organization and the allocation of talent. If talent is misallocated, this can be actually counterproductive, because what these policies do is that they allow firms that shouldn't exist to survive. Okay? Now, in the paper, in the lectures, we showed examples of one-off policies that improve the allocation of talent at a fraction of the cost of these other policies. The problem and the reason I think that we don't see these policies so often, is that they are like an investment. They have a very large upfront cost, and then they have large benefits over the course of many years. And these are not exactly the most popular type of policy with elected officers, because nobody likes to pay for a policies so that they're following the person who's elected after them will actually get the credit for the benefits. Now, this is very quickly some meta evidence on the ineffectiveness of these policies. On the right-hand side, these are estimates on the impact of business trainings on firm sales from a recent paper by David McKenzie. And by and large, these are very different forms of trainings, different genders, but most of them have at zero effect. They have zero in their confidence interval. On the right-hand side here, I have the figure from Rachel Meager's paper that does the meta-analysis of microfinance programs that come to a very similar conclusion. So what I've done in the lecture is to show how the organization of labor changes over the course of development as a myriad of self-employed split into a few entrepreneurs that hire most workers. Now, interestingly, this is true both across space. So if we look at development in the cross-section of countries in the world, but also across time. So if we take countries which are rich by today's standards, like the US, and we look back at the US 200 years ago, most people were self-employed, okay? And then became, as the US developed, became wage workers. I've also documented how this process stalls if access to jobs is driven by factors that are orthogonal to talent. And in the lectures, I've discussed the role of wealth inequality, and I've presented a recent paper of mine on poverty traps, which shows that those who are born poor tend to stay poor because they're born poor, because wealth interferes with the organization of talent, and therefore talented poor people are unable to get the jobs where their talent would be rewarded the most. And the second dimension that I analyzed in the lectures is that of gender. And there I showed how the talent of women is severely misallocated across countries, and how facilitating the participation of women in the labor force would increase productivity essentially at no cost. So most of the evidence that I've presented in the lectures focuses on the occupational choices of single individuals. Where do organizations come in the picture? Well, I think that the two-way link between organizational growth and aggregate productivity is a very important area for future research. And the reason for that is that organizations do the allocation of talent. Organizations thrive by putting together people of different talents to work jointly for a common objective. If they manage to do that, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Okay? However, doing this requires managerial skills. And managerial skills are a fixed factor, which suggests that there could be organizational traps. Okay? And that calls for policy. So why organizations? Here is one example. It comes from the same paper. No, sorry, it's not the same paper. It's another paper by David McKenzie, where they compared, it's a fascinating paper, forthcoming in JP, I think. They compare basically the classic training for micro enterprises with a different intervention. They compare it to giving the firms access to an accountant so that the owner doesn't have to do the job of the accountant. Now, if you think about it, this is the core source of productivity gain by organizations. If you are a self-employed or solo employed micro entrepreneur, you have to do everything. You have to be an accountant, you have to be a manager of yourself, you have to do the marketing, you have to do the engineering, invent things for your firm. You have to negotiate contracts. So you have to be all these things. And there are very few people that have the skills of doing absolutely everything well. And even then, comparative advantage would suggest that it's better to specialize. Now, bringing people together in organizations allows precisely that. And these graphs show that as the total employment of firms grow, this is from Nigeria, the share of firms where the owner keeps the account, this is the blue lines, falls. In small firms, the owner keeps all the accounts. As the firm exceeds 10, there are more firms that hire an accountant vis-a-vis firms that do it in-house. This is the same figure for marketing. So the fact that people have different talents, not just the fact that some people are smarter than others, but really an horizontal differentiation of talent, means that the larger the firm, the more specialized the roles. This improves the quality of the match, which leads to higher productivity, which leads to higher wages and higher demand, which makes the firms larger and hence more specialization and so on. So you see the virtuous circle that can start. So is growth a consequence of good organizations? I suspect it is. I'm working on this now, and I think there's plenty of work to do in this topic. Let me just show you some just basic facts that are consistent with the different bits of that story, okay? The first is that good matches lead to higher productivity. Lead is a big word because this is just a correlation, but what we do here is that we use a data set by the OECD that contains the skills of adults in the population. And what you see, what this ratio is the ratio of numeracy skills of the top, so the best blue collar workers, the top quarter of blue collar workers over the bottom quarter of managers. Okay? A ratio higher than 1 means that you could swap a blue collar worker and a manager, and the numeracy of the managerial class would go up, which I guess is a good thing. Now, a bit scarily, every country except France and Singapore are above 1. But what's more interesting to me is the negative slope with development. Okay? So poorer countries allocate their talent less well. Now, this is a fascinating finding in a new paper by David Auteur and co-authors, which shows how what they do is very cool. They take the US Census and they count the number of jobs that are listed among the possible jobs. And they see that as time goes by, there is more and more jobs, not as a number of people engaged in jobs, but rather more titles, more job titles, more type of jobs emerging. And they see that here in sectors that grow quicker, the growth is correlated with the creation of these roles, which suggests more specialization. Now, there can be other mechanisms that feeds into that virtuous circle. There is the fact that people prefer to be paid regularly, and big organizations can commit to do that. And at a macro scale, there's also the fact that the existence of formal firms allows the state to increase the tax base. Anders Jensen was a student of mine at the LSE, now at the Kennedy School. He has this super cool paper where he shows that the increase in the share of salaried workers is very strongly correlated with the increase in the tax base and hence the state capacity to tax its citizens. So one could think of an organizational poverty trap. So is the economy poorly organized because it's poor, or is it poor because it's poorly organized? For policy, we discussed this. I just want to conclude by saying that these are universal issues. Okay? These are not issues that can be studied only in low-income countries. Wealth and gender inequalities are pervasive everywhere, and they lead to misallocation in most countries in the world. To make matters worse, the pandemic has worsened rising inequality and falling mobility. And more interestingly, technology has transformed the employment relationship, and we are seeing a resurgence of casual labor, which in rich countries is called zero-hour contracts. But instead of waiting in the square of the village for some landowner to hire casual workers for the day, you wait in your cab, waiting for the Uber app to give you a ride. Right? And self-employment too, at very low levels of income. So these two figures are from the UK. The one on the left-hand side is self-employment, which is the dark blue line, is rising from like 2001 to 2016 here. And these are zero-hour contracts, again, from 2000 to 2016. You see there is a very rapid increase. Now, what I think we're missing is that if you take micro studies, I think they're super useful to uncover causal mechanisms in specific settings. But if we want to understand multiple equilibria and how people and countries move within them, we need to study the entire arc of development together, both to escape the poor equilibrium and to make sure not to fall back into it. But we don't have the tools to study this yet. Right? Now, as I was preparing these lectures, there is the reference missing. I went to read again the hybrid corn paper by Zvigilikis, and as I was looking for that paper, I found this other paper, which is an interview that Alan Kruger and Timothy Taylor did with Zvigilikis just before he passed away. This was published in 2000 in the Journal of Economic Perspective. And they were discussing all his life and all his papers, and he went on commenting on his diffusion paper, which is a milestone paper. And he said that actually, it's never really taken off that much. I mean, people know that paper, cite the paper, but nobody works on this. And because he puts it much better than I could ever put it, things change all the time. And when something new happens, things change, and how you go through some process in which the new equilibrium is established. And that's going to take time, but in economics, we don't have a theory of transition. So the field moves towards an interpretation where everything is in equilibrium all the time. So that basically rules out the study of the transition between equilibria. And we spend, I think, most of our lives out of equilibrium. So for young people starting to work now, but also old people like me, I think it's time to develop tools. There are lots more data that we have more powerful machines. It's time that we develop econometrics to study transition in between equilibria, because I think that's what we need to fully understand the process of development and how not to fall back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oriana. Just a quick reminder for everyone, some people have joined since we started. For asking questions, please feel free to write those questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to filter those and bring them, and I can read them. If you'd prefer to ask your question directly, you can also use the raise your hand button, and I'll do my best to kind of see that together with Anna, and we can call on you to ask your question. But I will use my privileged position of moderating the session to go ahead and start with some questions that I had as I was both watching the lectures and listening to Oriana now. For me, kind of the idea of poverty traps was something that I first heard about in university. For me, I was studying something outside of the social sciences and was reading some mainstream books like The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs, and hearing about poverty traps, and it kind of from that moment kind of left that idea a little bit behind and migrated towards micro applied studies, and have been working with IEPA on a variety of different RCTs. And when I came across this paper that you guys had done in Bangladesh, it was amazing to kind of circle back and see these individual micro studies trying to attack this big question about poverty traps and their existence, and kind of this transition from a state of this kind of this unstable steady state towards these different equilibria. And it was super interesting. From my perspective as being in this RCT world for a while, this paper is a massive undertaking. I am very impressed with this. It must have been a close collaboration with BRAC. And as someone who spends a lot of time discussing these research designs and trade-offs with researchers and practitioners, a few things strike me about this particular design. I'd like to kind of ask you about them. So one has to do with measuring things over a long term. And I see this in a lot of the papers that you've presented. I am impressed at measuring things even a couple years out, but doing that 6 years out, 11 years out is incredible. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And the other is your use of a structural equation within the papers that you're presenting, and using that for doing things like calculating cost benefit or cost effectiveness, and looking at policy counterfactuals, and also estimating these general equilibrium effects and things like that. So I think those are some areas that I'm curious about kind of starting with. So first on kind of like the long-term measurement, and I'm wondering, did you know going into these studies that you intended to be following a panel for many years, up to 11 years? And you have this interesting finding, for example, that in Bangladesh, the consumption amongst the treatment group, their beneficiaries fell in the first period relative to the control. And I've seen that happen a lot of times, that maybe people would throw their hands up and say, okay, this doesn't work, we need to kind of shut things down. How did you convince yourselves, your co-authors, partners, donors, to keep looking? What trade-offs did you consider? Obviously, there are things around costs, logistical challenges of finding people over time, versus the research benefits, or maybe justifying keeping the control for that long. Because once you do start to see things are positive, you have to weigh some of those benefits about, ethically, is this a time to roll out the treatment? And I've seen this discussion happen a lot. And to see the fruits of the labor that you guys have and that paid off, I'm curious how you think about that when going into studies, that kind of longer term measurement perspective.
Absolutely. So there's two separate questions that you're asking, which are both very important. The first is on the measure of success. So we use consumption as a measure of success. And now we have to understand why we do that in order to understand whether it's a good measure of success. We do that because it's a proxy for income. Because income is very hardly measurable when people are self-employed, right? They don't have a wage. They just have some nebulous income that we can't measure. And so in steady state, that's the important thing, in equilibrium, consumption is a very good proxy of income for poor people, because they're not going to save that much. In a program, however, that gives you assets and pushes you on an entirely new trajectory, looking at consumption after 2 years, it's not going to tell you much about the effect of the program, because people are not in steady state. So what happened there was that actually, luckily, relative to control, the average effect on consumption was small, but positive. But if you compare the people above and below the threshold, those above the threshold, which are precisely the ones that 11 years later end up with land, they had lower consumption. But not because they were hurt, but because they have the chance to save in order to build on that asset that BRAC gave them. So there was an enormously long debate on this, because the critics of the ultra poor program said this program doesn't work because it doesn't increase consumption. It doesn't increase consumption in the short run because people are saving so that they can consume more in the long run. So if you look, I don't think I showed this graph but I happen to have it here because I just taught this today. If you look at the difference between the people who escaped the trap and those who didn't over time in consumption, they are enormous by the end, but they're negative at the beginning. So I'm just gonna find it because it's a very important point, and it relates to the use of the on the poverty line. So the share of people under the poverty line, again, as a measure of success, because the poverty line is based on consumption. So if you use that as your measure of success, all the programs that, paradoxically, all the programs that are more effective because they put people on a different track are going to look worse. So here is the graph that I wanted to show you. So see, this is a diff in diff between people who escape the trap and those who don't, before and after the asset transfer. And you see that after 2 years, the difference is negative because the people who escape the trap are actually saving to accumulate more assets. By 2018, 11 years down the road, the difference is huge and positive. And that is because of assets. The difference in productive assets grows over time. So it's very important to understand why we're using consumption as an outcome in order to decide whether that's the right outcome to look at. On the ethics of keeping the controls for so long, you're absolutely right. So these to make sure the controls were kept as controls for 4 years. We kept on following the treated because the poverty trap identification comes within the treatment villages. So the first paper that we have on this data is the pure evaluation, and that ends after 4 years. I think it's, I mean, clearly it would have been, we would have seen more going forward, but at some point you do face that trade-off. And that trade-off is really tough. It's really, I mean, once you know how effective the program is, I think BRAC did the right thing. And that's what we agreed with them, that we would wait for, they would wait 4 years.
Yeah. And I think a thing about the measurement as well, I imagine you're thinking through the theory of this and actually thinking about this question of maybe consumption falling in the short run, but assets growing in the long run. And that's probably something you guys had in mind. And you had this model that you built as well, the structural model, which I think is amazing. And I love to see when researchers build that into the papers that they're doing that are applied, you know, micro level papers. And I think I want to ask you about a couple of things. One is the use of it for kind of cost effectiveness or maybe cost benefit analysis. I think, you know, estimating these types of cost effectiveness in an intervention is incredibly important, especially to a decision maker when thinking about how to invest the resources that they have, whether they're, you know, BRAC or this is a public official. And it can have important implications on also kind of targeting the intervention. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the approach to quantifying misallocation and, you know, basically what are, how do you kind of get there, and how can other researchers kind of use similar type approaches to being able to kind of measure cost effectiveness of interventions?
Absolutely. So it is hard to you know, do this purely from the reduced form estimates. The reduced form estimates are parameters that we can feed into the model. But in order to answer questions like, you know, if we were to scale up this intervention, would the general equilibrium effect be so big that they would kill all the positive effect, for instance? For that, a model is very useful because it allows us to look past what we've estimated. And, you know, no model is perfect, but what the model does, which is very useful, is that it gives you the conditions under which say, in case of the general equilibrium example, how much do prices of milk, say, have to fall for this intervention to have 0 returns, for instance. And then you realize that prices of milk would have to fall nearly to 0 for that to be the case, because the effect of the intervention is so good. So although we cannot swear by the model on the precise number. It gives you a range. So it tells you, if the factory were to open in the village and the salary would double, would these programs still be profitable, and so on. So we calculate the fact that wages would have to increase by a factor of 15 for the program not to make any sense. So this is, I think, the use of the model is being able to do all these counterfactuals.
Yeah, and I can imagine for BRAC, which is not a government and they're not working on election cycles, maybe that argument is very easy for them to think through. They can plan like longer term into the future. But you mentioned in the lecture, these kind of big push like interventions that require a heavier upfront investment to be able to see long-term benefits are not very politically palatable. How do you approach policymakers with this type of finding and kind of merge that with the challenges that they're up against? Because, for example, in Colombia, there are a lot of social protection programs that use cash transfers, or they've even expanded that during times of COVID, that are smaller transfers, more frequent, probably spread out over time. But in terms of, I think, the size of transfer that you're kind of seeing and studying here, that's probably something that at least the government in Colombia hasn't arrived to that level. So how have you had any conversations with policymakers, or how do you kind of imagine trying to make that more politically palatable?
We had, it's a bit like education. You have to make the argument of externalities, that we invest in education because in the future that will pay off. So I think it's a type of policy that should be delegated to. It shouldn't be it's a bit like I said. I think of central bank independence. When central banks were made independent from politicians' influence, monetary policy got transformed. Right before, central banks were printing money and inflation was out of control. Now, most central banks. So that has been accepted. I think we should have an independent department for social policy, because the long-term investments that are needed, we accept this for infrastructure. We build bridges, although the cost of the bridge is huge ex ante, and it's going to be, the benefits are going to happen in the future. We just have to think of this as building bridges that allow talented poor people to contribute to the economy. I think it's a kind of a change of mindset to tell the policymakers, you're spending money in building bridges. These are bridges.
Yeah.
I think we see social assistance as a current expenditure, whereas it should be seen as an investment.
Yeah. I'm curious, in the conversation around kind of the graduation model or the targeting the ultra poor programs, that I think I've heard a lot about how to kind of find which aspects of these big push programs are most effective for what people kind of at what time. And I don't know if in kind of the work that you've done, like how do we kind of like parse out the different components and find out which are most effective for which type of people kind of at what time, to try to make them a little bit cheaper, or be able to use those resources, even even larger amount of resources, but better targeted. It seems like this idea of like targeting aid better is going to become like more and more important to be able to implement these types of programs at a larger scale.
No, definitely. So the program, BRAC had been experimenting for a long time, and they believed that every component was needed. And so we never questioned that. In a way, like the way we work with organization is a collaboration. So we don't come out with we have questions which happen to coincide with their questions, but they, on the issue of should they do it without training or not, they said that asset transfers, they've seen them fail so many times without training that it wasn't worth a try. And so we believe that. So in this particular setting, I mean, it's a very interesting question. In other settings, it might be actually valuable to do that. In the setting of Bangladesh, the partner who has all the field knowledge thought that these people needed training. So training was never on the table to remove it. So. But you're right, it's half of the cost. So we could have treated twice as many people without training.
Yeah, for sure. And has BRAC taken this result and done anything special with it? Like, are they scaling things even larger? They're bringing this to more countries where they work?
Yes, absolutely. So the UltraPoor program is being implemented very widely. And as well as they're trying to take on board the idea of the poverty trap. So they're trying to target the transfer to how distant people are from the threshold.
Yeah.
Which,
and how do you identify that threshold in different areas? So I can imagine that's a big challenge, or is it?
It is, but there is a trick, right? So if you have the asset distribution and you get that the asset distribution is by model,
Right.
The bit where you have nobody, that's where the threshold must be.
Right.
Because
and I remember you showed some of those graphs in different places and mentioned, for example, in India, that wasn't as noticeable. I'm curious if you've expanded that study to more countries and how to kind of find out.
So this is actually an outcome of the data set that we put together, because we put the wealth data together, so we could do these distributions a bit everywhere, and that's why we have it in the paper. I can show it here because so everybody knows what we're talking about. So if you look, for instance, there, that one.
Yeah.
So if you look, for instance, this is Bangladesh in the DHS. So these are not the BRAC data. It looks exactly, you see it's by model. The numbers here means nothing because they're PCI scores. So that's Bangladesh, this is Pakistan. You see it's quite by model, but these are country level. So remember that if you sum many bimodal distributions, you can get a unimodal distribution. So, but still at the country level, we see this bimodality. I think it'd be interesting to do it in data sets which are at the same level of aggregation as the UltraPoor data set. For instance, when we evaluate programs, we often only collect data on the class of the beneficiaries. And to do this, we need the entire spectrum of
population.
Exactly.
Interesting. So I see we have a hand raised. I think Juan Vargas had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Rihanna. First of all, apologies for the background noise. I'm in the boarding area of the airport going to Bogota, and there's a lot of, this is the Caribbean coast of Colombia, so people are very noisy. So thank you for the lectures. I enjoyed a lot having a look at them and the summary that you did. And I guess I have two questions that are related to some of the discussion that you had with Kyle. So the first one has to do with sort of the political equilibrium. So there's a lot of misallocation of talent, as you've showed. But in some sense that reflects, I mean, it makes economic sense to correct that misallocation. In some sense that reflects the political equilibrium, the fact that there are lots of elites and the policy, the people who call the shots do benefit from this misallocation equilibrium in some sense. So I mean that makes it really difficult from us or from the policymaker perspective or from the market design perspective to correct those issues. So I just wonder, I mean, I guess in some settings such as the Bangladesh with BRAC and that partnership, it's relatively easy to get around that, but in most of the world, I guess that's a difficult thing to solve. So my first question is related to that. And the second question is related to also like the experiment itself. So many of the people in this audience that I can recognize from reading their names are either PhD students or master students who are going to start a PhD soon. And this is the type of, and I apologize for the background noise again. This is the type of experiment that not only it takes 11 years of wait, but also it takes over $1 million to carry out. So my question is, okay, so what is your advice for current PhD students or future PhD students that want to work in these issues? What is the shortcut that they can make so that they can contribute to this literature and to our understanding of poverty traps and how to solve it?
Absolutely. So from the last question, if you look at the authors in the list, in both papers, there were people who were PhD students at the time when we wrote the paper, actually even pre-docs at the time when we wrote the paper. And of course, because it takes time, now they're faculty somewhere. So in the last paper here, on the poverty trap paper, Claire Balboni was a PhD student at the LSE when we started. Anton Hale was a pre-doc. So now Anton is a PhD student and Claire is faculty. So these are big projects that really need help at every level of the professional hierarchy. So there is always demand for help because they need field work. So we need somebody to be on the field and we can't spend too much time on the field. So when you join your PhD group, make clear to the people who do this type of work that you're willing to help. And there is always demand for that type of labor. Also, we don't do 11 years papers, launching it, and then it's like the sound that goes to Mars and wait 11 years until we analyze the data. We looked at the 2-year outcomes, we look at the 4-year outcomes, and so we live with the project, and there are outputs along the way. But there's no doubt that it's a patience game. You have to be very patient for this. For what you said about, the people who are in power stand to lose from making space to those below, that is tragically true. But again, it's something that we have to change the zero-sum game mentality. I think we currently always think of the world as a fixed pie. So if we give more chances to a group, then our group will also lose chances. But in practice, so this is particularly true for the gender issue. People see it as, well, if we give it to women, then men won't have it. And so it's almost got to the point where some women in advocacy say, oh no, now men have to pay because it's our turn. But that, I think, is completely wrong, because a better allocation of talent increases the size of the pie. So there is more for everybody. And at least in the case of women, just because there are so many women, like half of the world population are female, the increase in the pie is more than enough to compensate everybody. So I think that's the mentality. It's not like fighting for the Picasso Guernica, of which there is one. So if El Prado has it, the Louvre can't have it, and vice versa. This is an increase in the size of the pie.
Yeah, kind of moving a little bit towards the second lecture. You started by explaining this new data set in that lecture, and you mentioned it in your overview, this data set, Jobs of the World. And it sounds like that's being made public. I think there's probably a lot of interest in this group to understand a little bit more about those data, how it's constructed, how researchers and even practitioners could access it and use it for analysis. And I'm curious, not only from the research side, but too, like from a policymaker perspective, are there things that policymakers and practitioners can use those data for to be able to make decisions? So this is more an opportunity too to kind of explain that and kind of sell that data set, because I know when I saw it in the lecture, and then when you mentioned it here, it sounds like a tremendous resource. So I'd love to hear more about it. And I don't know if people have particular questions as they kind of heard about those data set to ask about what's available in it and how they could potentially access and use it.
Let me see if I can show it. I can show you the beta version because it's not public yet, but
limited release.
I can do a sneak preview. Let me see. It's gonna become public very, very soon. So as I said, the reason I put it together is that I thought that we need, the typical question that you get when you run an experiment is the external validity question. It's like, how common is this phenomenon in the world? And also you want to know how many people are doing casual jobs like the people that we treated in Bangladesh. So that's where I put it together. Now, I think that once it's there, actually, I realized that you can do a lot more, because when you see the statistics, say on the World Bank or ILO databases, they're already aggregated. So they're never aggregated at the level that you would want. Whereas this is the microdata, so you can aggregate them however you want. And you can use the data sets in two ways. You can either, I can't find it, sorry, I can't find the beta version, it's on a different computer. You can either use it to download figures directly, and you can use that for teaching and to verify that your setting fits kind of the general patterns or not. Or you can use it to download the data and do whatever you want with it. It's a public resource, because frankly, I think that when I agreed to become director of the Gender and Labor Market Initiative, I thought that people cannot do research unless they have the tools. And so we want more research on labor markets. So let's make it easy for people to do so. That's why the data set's being built.
Yeah, great. So I see a couple of questions in the chat. One is just kind of a question about the first experiment in Bangladesh. Was this mostly in rural areas? Did it also include more extreme poverty in any urban areas? And how might you expect that changing if that intervention was applied in an urban setting?
So this was exclusively rural areas and kind of peri-urban, but obviously you can't really give a cow somebody who lives in a city. The principle, however, is the same. I think if you look at very poor urban areas, the equivalent would be training to get a job. And we are working with BRAC now in urban areas to evaluate training programs. Okay? And there, again, we're looking at whether there are poverty traps, in the sense that people can't afford training, and hence they do not get training and they remain poor because they can't afford it in the first place. And we've seen that offering a contract where they only pay after they get a job increases the demand for training a lot, especially from the poorer and more credit constrained people. And actually this links to a paper by Stefano Caria, which I spoke about in, I think, the third of the lectures, which shows, is quite remarkable. It shows that basically subsidizing an application cost, a $5 subsidy has the same effect as $100 increase in salary in terms of attracting talent to organizations. That's because it unlocks a poverty trap. So I think in urban areas, you want to do training. In richer countries, you want to do maybe human capital. I'm sure that there are plenty of very talented people in Britain who cannot afford to go to university. So it depends on the context, but the mechanism is always the same. It's an investment which is small by most people's views, but it's enormous from the point of view of somebody who's poor, and so it's completely inaccessible.
Yeah. And I think on this, and you talked about this in the third lecture, I'm curious because I'm actually in a conversation now with a international organization, an arm of the Colombian government. They're thinking how to bring people who have either lost their jobs or are in lower levels of employment due to COVID back into employment, or to bring them into formal employment for the first time. And they're thinking of smaller interventions and working with large firms who want to accept talent, but have a difficulty in matching to some of those individuals. And so they're trying to think of kind of different interventions. And beyond maybe lowering the cost of applying, one of the challenges that they've brought up a lot is maybe it's a question of like signaling or documentation. So there's a lot of individuals who don't have, you know, a CV. They have lots of experience, but haven't maybe written it down, or because they're migrants, they don't have certifications that are accepted in Colombia. And so there's kind of that issue, or maybe like letters of, they're thinking of interventions like letters of recommendation, some way to signal to an employer kind of ability, especially amongst a maybe more vulnerable migrant population, someone who's been working in informality, which is a huge issue in Colombia. I'm kind of curious if you have any kind of ideas beyond lowering the application costs, what other aspects of application can be helpful for kind of matching new workers or informal workers to formal jobs when there is the demand?
Absolutely. So certification. So it's all these business support services, which are largely absent in low-income settings. So certification is super important. My co-author, Vittorio Bassi, who again was a PhD student when we started the project and now is a faculty at USC, his job market paper did precisely that in Uganda, labor markets, urban labor markets for young people without any experience. How could they signal? Well, BRAC provided them a certificate and provided the certificates to the firms as well. And this certificate certified the skills that the students had acquired in the vocational training. And that increased the matching rate substantially. And the cost is zero, it's a piece of paper. So this is super important, I think. Because information, asymmetric information is a leading cause of traps, because you think that the person is not appropriate for the job, so you don't try them out, so you'll never know.
Yeah. And do you think these strategies kind of on this, good matches lead to higher productivity, these strategies, are they different for men and women? Is this something that is also kind of an issue, and that kind of goes to your second lecture, but I'm curious to know, like, on the kind of the gender dynamic, are these strategies a little bit more universal, or are there certain things that work better for men and women?
I think it depends largely on the culture of the place, I think. So, if it's a place where women cannot go out on their own, of course, you need to take, or they can only go out if they're in an all-female environment, then you have to take that into account. I think that is very, very culturally sensitive, I think.
Yeah.
So
Someone asked in the chat here about misallocation of women's talent, and they mentioned that in some developing countries, we saw the gap of labor market participation between men and women increase during the pandemic, and it's not closing to pre-pandemic levels very quickly. Do you think that women's allocation of talent can be behind that, or kind of responsible for that phenomenon?
I think that we're really at a fork in the road on that point, because the working from home, the ability of working from home can be actually, a double-edged sword, because as we're returning to the office, if it becomes kind of voluntary to go back to the office, I can imagine an equilibrium where the women are the ones working from home. But then if you're the only one at home, you're going to be the one who deals with the guy who comes to repair the washing machine. You're going to be the one who takes the kids takes care of the kids if the school closes or if the kid is sick. So I think there is a potential to return to a much less equal division of work inside and outside the home, as there is the potential of a more equal division between men and women. But we clearly at the fork in the road. I can see it going both ways.
Yeah.
And
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, if I find it, I'll show you something quite depressing, but
Oh, no.
in a kind of a funny way. In a kind of a funny way. Let me see if I find it. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no,
I'm happy to answer another question. Why?
Yeah, I guess in terms of kind of, again, moving back to kind of potential interventions, that could potentially be tested and scaled on this kind of, topic of misallocation of women's talent. And I'm thinking or have in mind this recent paper by, I think it's Leo Bernstein and authors who are working in Saudi Arabia. They did, I don't know if you're kind of know this paper, where they basically measured men's perception of like female labor force participation, like their own, and what they thought other men around them thought. And basically they were more okay with their wives working outside of the home compared to what they thought was the social norm. And when they then re-showed the result of that information, I think this is how it went back to those men. It then led to their wives more active in the labor market outside of the home, and then having downstream effects. And that seems like a really amazing, small but powerful example about how our own misperceptions can lead to kind of these longer term effects in like the labor market. Yeah, I'm curious if you know of any other examples of things like that, other interventions or kind of ideas or thoughts on kind of these smaller kind of interventions that could potentially be scaled to help kind of alleviate some of that trap.
So precisely on the women participation issue, not so much, but there is a lot of evidence on misbeliefs and misperceptions that can create these self-fulfilling vicious cycles, which can be broken by just providing information. So when I was telling you about the fork in the road, this is what I had in mind. So this is an advertisement by the UK government. I kid you not, this came out in 2020 for the coronavirus. Okay. So I don't know if you can see. Can you see my screen? Can you see this?
Yeah, I can see your screen, and I can see that in each of these four examples, they're obviously representing only one part of the population.
I'm gonna zoom in, and you see here the woman is taking care of the kid, the woman is teaching the kid, the woman is cleaning the house. And the interesting thing is that, sorry, where did it go? Let me make it big again. Look at this one. So here the woman is cleaning the house with her daughter, right? So the mom and the daughter clean the house. And where is the dad? The dad is here. He's watching TV. And where is the son? The son is also there. He's gone away. Watching TV with the dad. So this is what worries me. But maybe I'm too pessimistic.
No, I think that
this ad was so embarrassing for the UK government that they withdrew it immediately, but so many people took pictures of it and they use it in all the talks.
Yeah, I can imagine. I see Anna sent me a question in the chat. Which one?
It was already answered, Kyle. Is the last one that you already read.
Okay.
Sorry.
Great. And please feel free, and if I'm missing people who are raising hands or things, please feel free to jump in directly. Going back to some notes here. Yeah, one one kind of thing that I had on the kind of this idea of the organizational poverty trap, which I think is a really interesting idea. I think in kind of the study of the microfinance literature and finding that, microfinance maybe wasn't as effective as everyone hoped. And same thing with business training. A lot of the conversation that I've heard is more, I mean, there are a couple of things. One could be like, oh, we need to make the model better, make microfinance more flexible. People are using it for insurance, not necessarily for making productive investments. That's because the repayment rate or repayment is like, the number one thing, make them more flexible, like improve the model. Or the same thing maybe with training. Maybe the way in which training is done isn't, very, very effective. We need to find a way to make it more effective. But you pose like an interesting hypothesis, which I have heard a little bit as well. Maybe not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. If someone came to me and offered me my salary, like to start a business right now, I wouldn't necessarily have kind of an idea myself. And there are a lot of people who are actually entrepreneurs who maybe as well, like don't really want to maybe even grow their business, or maybe they would like to leave being an entrepreneur. So the idea of just like, hey, take this money and grow your business. They're like, no, I'm looking to leave this and go do something else. I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. And I'm curious if there's any specific kind of data to back that up, or if you've seen something where that's been tested more directly, like people don't want to be entrepreneurs, so they actually don't want to grow their business. They want to leave, that situation. Because I don't know if I've seen that directly. It seems like a really simple, fundamental thing that maybe we're wasting a lot of time working on people growing their business when they just don't want to,
Exactly. So there is a recent paper by Emily Bress and Supreet Kaur. They do something very clever. What they do is that basically they create labor shortages in Indian villages by hiring people. So they go to these villages and they hire like 25% of the workers.
They like create a business and just
they create a business and they hire
people.
So there is these withdrawal workers, and they measure what happens to the wage in the slack season in agriculture and in the peak season. So in the slack season, nothing happens to the wage. You reduce labor supply by 25% and the wage remains the same. So that suggests that there is a huge amount of pent-up constrained demand, right? It's basically Sir Arthur Lewis development with unlimited supplies of labor. There is an unlimited amount of workers out there. And where does it come from, this labor? All the self-employment. So self-employment goes down. In the peak season, where people work in agriculture and so on, that's when they see the normal increasing wage because they withdraw wage from the agricultural markets. But in the slack season, there is a huge amount of excess supply of labor. So this is actually good evidence, I think, to show that point. The other thing, by revealed preferences, the fact that the richest people in these villages, as soon as they can, get a wage job, suggests that on average, probably wage jobs are what people want, because we're not talking entrepreneurs here as being successful, starting a new firm and making millions. These are all people who are running, small food stalls or selling small, like weaving baskets and selling baskets on the street. It's not exactly, like an enterprising activity. So I think, but by and large, they're mostly subsistence entrepreneurs.
Yeah, interesting. Do we have any other kind of questions from the group? Please feel free to jump in and ask if you have things. Trying to review as well. Chat. I mean, this question too about the bigger picture question on needing the econometrics to study this transition or change between multiple equilibria. seems like a huge undertaking. So if you guys want to divide into small groups now, we can just start solving that issue right here in the discussion. I don't have anything else myself kind of prepared, so I don't know if there are any other things from the audience that you want to kind of bring up. Now is your opportunity. And if not, I think we'll probably move towards wrapping up. So I guess, Oriana, thank you so much for your time and for putting together the lectures. Incredibly interesting, and I'm excited to see the direction that this work is going. It'll be fun to continue to follow that and kind of hopefully see this point about the econometrics of transition develop over time, so that we can be able to study these multiple equilibria. It seems like a really fascinating direction for the field to go. And I know some of the things you've discussed are already kind of putting some seeds in my head in terms of some of the discussions I'm having with policymakers and practitioners as they are looking to kind of match, job seekers coming out of the pandemic towards firms who have a demand but don't have a good mechanism for being able to hire those workers. So it'll be fun, and I may ping you with more questions as they come up in those discussions. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for everyone for joining, and I'm excited for the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Good luck for the rest of the conference. Looks like a fantastic program. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
We will use that rain check that we gave you to invite you to Bogota. I hope so.
I will not forget. I will not forget.
There's a recording of this session, so we have that in
Exactly.
It's documented one.
Exactly.
Cool.
Adios.
Thank you.